Hello, this is Michael Paris. I'm preparing this video lecture and several others for Political Science 338, Civil Rights and Civil Liberties, just to cover some material we didn't quite get to cover in class. So I'm going to try to break these up into 4 15-minute segments, and there's a matching PowerPoint. I'm sorry, let me just reopen my PowerPoint so I can direct you to the particular slides that we're going to be using. So the PowerPoint is called School Desegregation Law and Policy After Brown. And we've got 4 big things to do in these 4 segments. The first thing I want to do is do a kind of a quick and dirty overview of the southern phase of the civil rights movement. And I think this is interesting because we want to think more broadly about the Supreme Court as an institution, its role in the larger political system, and how that played out. And that'll be basically the first video. This will take us to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And then I'm going to talk about the Civil Rights Act of 64 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And at that point, in the second video, I will backtrack and talk about school desegregation and the particulars of school desegregation after Brown through 1968. The third video will discuss 2 important cases, the 2 cases where the U.S. Supreme Court really re-enters the field, Green v. New Kent County School Board in 1968, and Swan v. Charlotte-Mecklenburg School District in 1971. And then the fourth video will cover the 2 other cases and some of the subsequent history after them. Those cases are Keyes v. Denver School District No. 1 in 1973, and Milliken v. Bradley, or the Detroit busing case in 1974. All 4 of those cases, Green, Swan, Keyes, and Milliken, are in one PDF file. So the PowerPoint that I'm going to be using and referring to is on Blackboard. And again, it's called School Desegregation Law and Policy After Brown. And the cases that you're going to be responsible for thinking about, and hopefully these videos will help you do that, are also on Blackboard. So let me start with the court and politics and the civil rights movement. One of the ironic things about the court after the New Deal is that it becomes a kind of opportunity point, a venue, an institutional venue for people without power to try to produce change, right? And this is a little odd because the Supreme Court was really designed as a backward-looking institution. I'm sorry I'm not looking at you, but I'm playing with another computer over here. It was designed to look backward and be kind of a conservative force to look at and develop and articulate the fundamental principles of moments where the people really spoke, and to uphold those principles against current majorities that might want to produce change, as in the New Deal period when the court looked backward to ideals from the past and put the brakes on the New Deal for a while until it was overwhelmed with democratic mobilization. After the New Deal, reformers, and particularly the Black freedom struggle or strands of the Black freedom struggle, are using the courts to frame issues in moral terms, pursue change, mobilize people for politics. And that's very much the case with Brown. Now, we've talked about Brown. We've talked about the ambiguities in the opinion. We called it an opaque landmark. I borrowed that phrase from a good book on education reform by a guy named James Ryan. It's an opaque landmark. You could read Brown in many different ways to stand for many different propositions. Is it about color blindness and the irrationality of racial categorization? Is it about some positive right to something called equal educational opportunity? What about the distinction between legally mandated school segregation on one hand and so-called de facto or just actually existing segregation on the other? Are both constitutionally suspect, or is it only intentional or legally mandated segregation? So we talked about all of these ambiguities. Complicating the picture further, we have Brown 2, which if you read it carefully, it's about remedy, so it's really not an opinion that purports to be about defining a right. But the language of Brown 2, we always talk about all deliberate speed, but I think more importantly, the language of Brown 2 is the language of racial neutrality. And what's the right? To be admitted to schools on a non-racial basis, or sometimes the court says non-discriminatory, seems to call to mind color blindness. But as we know, we have this remedy problem. Like, what is it that the courts could or should actually order anybody to do, given total segregation of the schools by law in these states? All right, so that's sort of by way of summary of where we left off with Brown. Brown was an earthquake. Its immediate impact wasn't so much in school desegregation. Not much school desegregation happened in the South for at least 10 years. Nothing of substance till 15 years later. And this kind of goes against your idea that the courts say what the law is and everybody agrees. Nobody agreed, and nobody really did anything for a while. And we're going to talk about why that is and how change actually did come. But everybody knew that Brown meant the death of Jim Crow, that this regime within a regime was in real trouble, given what Brown was understood to mean about legally mandated segregation. And the immediate impact was on politics in the South, and the immediate impact was about polarization, was giving African Americans hope and encouragement, and the idea that if they were involved in the struggle, that their claims might be listened to, that they may succeed. Martin Luther King is sort of famous for saying that if we're wrong, God's wrong. If we're wrong, the Supreme Court is wrong. So God and the court become kind of merged in that rhetoric. But it also inflamed what came to be known as massive resistance in the South. No, like, we will fight this to the death. So if you move to my second slide on the PowerPoint, this is, I hope no historian ever sees this, because this is, like, these are milestones of the Civil Rights Movement. So if my task is to cover the Civil Rights Movement in 20 minutes or so, this is what I'm doing. It's just our kind of high school textbook understanding of the Southern phase of the movement, and I'll add some commentary, but I think this is important context, right? So it's about polarization, expanding the scope of the conflict, eventually national and international attention to this peculiar regime within a regime in the United States. And really the story of the Southern phase of the Civil Rights Movement begins with the Montgomery bus boycott. So we have Brown in May of 1954. Brown 2 comes about a year later. In December 1955, a black seamstress, as you all know from high school, named Rosa Parks, refuses to give up her seat on a city bus in the white section, and she's arrested. She was an activist. She was involved with people who were looking for test cases and training for this. She wasn't just the woman whose feet were tired. And the boycott has been planned, and it follows. And it is a boycott. It means that we're not going to buy this product. We're not going to ride the buses. And it imposes substantial sacrifice to do so, but you're withdrawing economic support for this business operation. And the thing about the Montgomery bus boycott that's vital is there's a new minister who's arrived in town. He's 26 years old. And he's asked to play a leadership role in this, and of course his name is Martin Luther King Jr. Overnight, 95% of blacks aren't using the buses. Does economic damage, again at great cost to these people who have to walk and not use the bus system. There's a lot of conflict, there's a lot of violence. King's home is bombed. But it ends successfully about a year later, at the end of 1956, with a court order that says, no, you cannot mandate segregation on these buses. That violates the federal Constitution. The court doesn't write an opinion. It just affirms that that's the rule. In fact, in many cases after Brown, the court just said, we affirm a decision striking down a segregation law without writing about it. These are called per curiam opinions. The Southern resistance then starts to escalate, right? So a couple things are happening here. 101 members of Congress sign a manifesto. It's known as the Southern Manifesto, attacking Brown, saying it's illegitimate constitutional lawmaking by the court, that it's not a lawful decision. They urge resistance by all lawful means, which of course encourages some unlawful means as well. A few Southerners don't sign it. Lyndon Baines Johnson is there, and he doesn't sign it. He's from Texas. Al Gore's father doesn't sign it. And the other thing that happens out of the bus boycott is a new organization, a new civil rights organization forms. It's called the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the SCLC, and King kind of leads that movement, that formation that is church-based. 1957, right? I have these sort of milestones on my outline. Congress passes a Civil Rights Act, and Lyndon Johnson from Texas was vital in getting it passed and vital in making sure it didn't actually mean anything or do anything. And he was quite a talented legislative maneuverer, so that's something he could do. In September 1957, we do have a school desegregation conflict that garners national attention and international attention. And this is, of course, the Little Rock crisis. So a quick word about that. This happens in Little Rock, Arkansas. Arkansas was known as a more moderate place, a place that wasn't quite as bad as other parts of the South. And its governor was known as a bit of a moderate. His name was Orville Faubus. And court and the school board had come up with a plan to make the prompt and reasonable start that Brown 2 required. So 9 black children were scheduled to go to the formerly all-white Little Rock High School. And it isn't clear why, but Faubus, the governor, a week before school started, either got scared of something or thought this would be a way to score political points. But he goes to court. He gets a state court order stopping the integration of the school because there would be violence. There was no indication before this that there would be violence, no real evidence of it, but this is what he said. So he starts this crisis off by going to court and stopping the integration process with respect to these 9 black children. The federal district court promptly overturns the state court order, and in response, Faubus mobilizes the state National Guard, right, the Arkansas National Guard, to block desegregation. So now you have a governor mobilizing people with guns to stand in the way of what a federal district court says has to happen. And this draws moderate Republican President Dwight David Eisenhower into the conflict. Eisenhower doesn't want to do this. He doesn't want to be involved, but really you've got a question of sovereignty here. The state is defying federal authority, so it's a much larger issue than the purpose and pace of school desegregation. And what followed was really quite extraordinary. Eventually, Eisenhower, after maneuvering, has to call out the 101st Airborne. He has to nationalize the Guard and control it, and use an army, army units to escort the 9 children into school. And they're battling angry mobs. So this went on for a year. And on the outline, you see Cooper v. Aaron. The following year, the U.S. Supreme Court did say that the state cannot whip up mobs and create violence and then use that violence as an excuse not to have school desegregation. A lower court had called a timeout in light of the violence, and there was a significant amount of chaos and violence. And the Supreme Court quashed that and said, no, this has to go forward. Every justice signed the opinion. We say the law. We are the Supreme Court. If you read Cooper v. Aaron, it's quite remarkable for an assertion of the court as the premier interpreter of the Constitution, and everybody else must listen. I'm going to fast forward now to 1960, and I think, let me just parenthetically say, I think you can understand the civil rights movement in 3 moments. There's the first phase to 1960 that's about boycotts and picketing and using courts and lawful means, really, as means of protest. 1960, people start engaging in civil disobedience, and it's principled and it's nonviolent, but it creates more polarization and violence. So the use of nonviolent civil disobedience sort of marks the next phase. And I think 1963, 1964, you start to see something more potentially threatening, mass defiance mass demonstrations, riots, violence, an escalation of the nature of the tactics and the conflict. So 1960 is another turning point. 1960 is the year that a young, telegenic, handsome Democrat from Massachusetts runs for president, Senator John F. Kennedy. He projects an image of youthfulness and vigor and progress and being forward-looking. The reality of Kennedy was much more ineffectual and conservative as a president, really. The reality, it doesn't match the imagery and the iconography. But there's this image of change. He wins in 1960 in a very close election, almost a tie. He's running against the vice president at the time, Richard M. Nixon. So Kennedy wins, and this sort of marks the transition. The movement itself, the civil rights movement, is becoming deeper and more diversified and gaining more support. So early in 1960, even before Kennedy is elected, in February of that year, 4 students at Greensboro, North Carolina, A&T College, they start the sit-in movement. They sit in at lunch counters, and they're arrested. And these sit-ins then spread like wildfire throughout the South. And this is civil disobedience. Oftentimes, these protesters are beaten. They're defying segregation laws, and thereby posing the issue of whether those segregation laws are constitutional. And out of the sit-in movement, there's a new organization that SCLC leaders were involved in setting up. It's called the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. A New Yorker named Ella Baker was instrumental in setting this up. This brings young people into the movement, and they're going to be the shock troops of the movement, right? They're going to take all the chances. They're going to be organizing everyday, ordinary people for democratic action. They're going to be experiencing the brunt of the violence. And this matters because that experience mattered later in the 60s. Wonderful book on SNCC. I mean, my favorite book on SNCC is by a historian named Claiborne Carson called In Struggle. It's a lovely book, published maybe in the 80s. Now, at this point, Kennedy and the Democratic Party have a big problem, because a huge base of the Democratic Party since Roosevelt has been the white South, right? The white elites in the South who benefit economically and are happy to support the New Deal, and the Democrats as long as you don't mess with the racial issue. Well, now there's really no choice. More and more blacks have migrated to the North. They can vote there. They're putting pressure on the Democratic Party. There's a fault line in the Democratic Party. And blacks are big supporters of the Democratic Party, too, in many places in the country. So the Kennedy administration is really marked by one crisis after another. And I'm going to just see where we are on our slides. So I'm still on slide number 2. So we've gotten to the sit-ins and the founding of SNCC. Another civil rights organization based in the North is called the Congress on Racial Equality, and they're going to be the sponsors of something that was called the Freedom Rides in 1961. Kennedy isn't happy with this pressure. I mean, he wants to spend his own time on foreign policy and international affairs. He kind of delegates civil rights to his Attorney General, who also happened to be his little brother, Robert F. Kennedy. And they're trying to channel the movement into more moderate efforts like voting rights and to get away from confrontational demonstrations and civil disobedience. But this effort of CORE with the Freedom Rides in 1961 poses Kennedy's first challenge. And the idea was that federal law and courts had already said that interstate transportation had to be desegregated. Around that time, a federal the Supreme Court actually had ruled that the desegregation that was required also included terminals, restaurants, bathrooms, things around the transportation nodes. So CORE's idea was, let's test this, let's get whites and blacks on buses in Washington, and we'll bus ride through the South and test all the segregation laws at the terminals. So you can imagine how this is going to turn out, this journey from Washington through the Deep South to New Orleans. They were okay. Things went okay until they reached Alabama, where one of the buses was surrounded and burned. And miraculously, if you ever saw the footage and the beatings, no one was killed. They went on to Birmingham, where again they weren't protected and they were severely beaten. In Montgomery, they were arrested for their own protection and put in jail. And it went on like this. They went to Mississippi and they were arrested again. And this led Kennedy to issue an executive order requiring federal force to enforce desegregation in interstate transportation, and this included the facilities at the stops. So this sets the pattern. The movement is saying we will force these confrontations between federal and state authority. In 1962, attention shifted to the University of Mississippi and a man named James Meredith. And Meredith simply wanted admission to Ole Miss, and he had a court order ordering that he be admitted. He walked in with that court order, but in front of him was a Mississippi governor, a guy named Ross Barnett, who was blocking his access. So again, just like Faubus in Little Rock, we have Barnett in Mississippi 5 years later defying federal authority. Kennedy, like Eisenhower with Faubus, had negotiated with Barnett, but eventually Kennedy was forced to use federal force to have Meredith admitted, the lone first single black admitted to the University of Mississippi. There's an escalation. There was a 15-hour riot. 2 people were killed, hundreds were injured, lots of property destroyed. And Kennedy's Assistant Attorney General Burke Marshall once said, look, if you're fighting with the president in this kind of situation, you're going to lose. The president could send, battalions if he wanted to. Kennedy actually sent 30,000 federal troops to maintain order on the campus and surrounding area. And Meredith was then admitted. Meanwhile, and I'm wrapping up here, I know this is going a little longer than I promised, but in 1962 and 1963, the civil rights organizations are coordinating a bit more, and they're doing sort of city-to-city campaigns. They're going to try to go to specific places. In 1962, it was Albany, Georgia. 1963, it was Birmingham, Alabama, to challenge segregation laws. And in the spring of 1963, the organizations, particularly SCLC, it was SCLC's campaign, but SNCC was involved, selected Birmingham, Alabama, which was probably the most racist place in the country at the time. There was a sheriff and city commissioner named Eugene Bull Connor, and they could be counted on to respond with violence, and that was part of the strategy. They called it Project C for confrontation. So they go to Birmingham, and they're promoting boycotts of downtown stores, and they're doing lots of street demonstrations and marching and picketing. People are starting to be arrested. And the city officials then go to their state courts and get a court order, a state court order, that you can't have these demonstrations, banning marches, right? Now, King and SCLC, they have a tough choice because they've been telling everyone, obey the law, obey the courts are on our side. Their rule of law approach to a ban from the state court is to appeal and let the legal process take its course. That would take too much time, and they decided to risk disobeying that order and being arrested as opposed to going through the legal process. And this is where King actually decides to be arrested in defiance of this court order. It lands him in a Birmingham jail. He writes his famous letter from a Birmingham jail at that moment. And the demonstrations then keep picking up. And the leaders of the movement used school children. One of them said we had 4,500 people in jail and 20,000 more waiting to get in. So it's a huge crisis. And the tension is so high, that's what leads to the violence that the movement wanted broadcasted nationally and globally. So the images you all know of police turning fire hoses and police dogs on demonstrators beating children. This is part of this process of confronting segregation and racial oppression. The disorder and the rioting spread. The demonstrations spread to the north. There's more conflict. Things are really heating up. In Birmingham, there are business elites who want nothing if not to do business, so they're pushing some kind of settlement with the protesters because the protest is hurting business and Birmingham's reputation. And it's at this moment that JFK comes off the fence and he gives a national speech, a national address on television in June of 1963, where he says, this is a moral issue. The fires of discord are burning north and south, and we need to do something. So it's here that he says, I will propose a Civil Rights Act. And this later becomes the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So that was about 26 minutes, 10 minutes longer than I planned, but I'm going to stop there. This is the end of video 1 on school desegregation and civil rights after Brown, and video 2 will pick up with the provisions and meaning of the Civil Rights Act of 1964.